Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you to everyone here, the other panelists and scientists for global responsibility who have done amazing work on the link between climate and militarism for many, many years. So I'm based at Commonwealth, which is a economic policy think tank, but I'm also co-director of Transition Security Project, which is a center for research and policy founded by Commonwealth and another think tank based in the US called the Climate and Community Institute. And we investigate the climate, economic, and geopolitical impacts of militarization, mostly related to the UK and US context in which we're based. So I basically want to give some background today, and obviously a lot of the discussion is about the education system, but really I want to kind of inject some of that climate impact into our thinking as well. And it's great to see that that's come up in the discussion so far. So I'm going to discuss a bit about how militarism and the climate crisis are connected and kind of situate this moment of militarization within the moment that we're in of planetary crisis. And I'll conclude with some reflections on kind of what that means for us and for those who are kind of thinking about and working on the education system at the moment. So is often hidden in climate debates or within the climate movement, and that's because basically because of lobbying by the US military in 1997 to exclude to exclude military emissions from the Kyoto Protocol. So, although militarism might not be prominent when we think about the climate crisis, we actually have to look at the reality, which is that militaries occupy 5.5% of global emissions. So that's more than civilian shipping and aviation combined. They're a very, very significant source of emissions. And most of those emissions come from NATO member states, most significantly, of course, the largest military power within NATO, which is the US. And to contextualize that a little bit, the US military is the world's largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels. So if it gets its $1.5 trillion budget that has been requested by the Trump administration, the US military would become an equivalent source of emissions to the entire country of the Philippines. That's a country of 115 million people. So when we think about militarism and climate crisis, obviously we can see that the direct emissions alone from military powers, from the development and exertion of military force is something that is significant in climate terms. And when we come to the UK context, or obviously as kind of a fundamental understanding, it's important to look at the UK military as part of a wider US military architecture. So while the US military has about 800 overseas bases, the UK has many overseas bases. One estimate puts it at 150 overseas bases and installations, which are integrated within that kind of wider US architecture. So even though we have a smaller military, it is complementary to that US military, which is a massive source of emissions. And even so, our military is a significant emission source in its own right. It's equivalent to the use of 700,000 cars across a year, and it occupies about 40% of the carbon footprint of our public sector. So the UK and US militaries, both significant players in terms of their emissions contributions. They play that kind of very clear and obvious direct role within the climate crisis. But the link between militarism and climate crisis is much deeper than just emissions. If you look at the kind of the origins of the fossil fuel economy, you can really see that Britain, as an imperial power in the 19th century, was a pioneer of both the use of fossil fuels as military fuels, and then as fossil fuels as kind of objects of military competition in order to exert economic dominance. So while you had the UK, the British military using first coal and then oil as a naval fuel, and those fuels becoming kind of important objects of military competition, you then later had throughout the 20th century wars fought over fossil fuels in order to kind of exert economic dominance in other parts of the world. And I think a great example of that is the 1953 coup against the democratically elected government in Iran, in which both the US and the UK played a role alongside BP to secure the fossil fuel supplies of Iran after they were nationalized by the democratically elected government there. So historically, we've seen that as well as the kind of the energy intensity of militaries, that they are often also seeing the kind of strategic importance of fossil fuels and fighting wars in order to kind of gain access to fossil fuel supplies. But that's kind of transformed as well in the present, and the way that fossil fuels interact with military power is kind of undergoing further change. And the most kind of recent and perhaps important example of this is the US's so-called energy dominance agenda, in which it's using its own domestic fossil fuel sector and also its military power as kind of combined levers of coercion. So we've seen in Cuba, for instance, the US has imposed a full-scale fuel blockade on Cuba, which has meant that hospitals have been lacking power and people have died as a result. The country is facing an economic crisis, but also in kind of less brutal and less stark ways, we can see that the US has exerted immense pressure on Europe after the Russian invasion of Ukraine to replace its imports of Russian gas with expensive liquefied natural gas imports from the US. And that in turn has left European countries exposed to energy shocks, which have come themselves in this latest version from American militarism. So what we have is that while militaries are themselves kind of drivers and drivers of climate crisis and sources of emissions, you also have a system in which military coercion, military power, and the power of states is combined with the fossil fuel economy, and fossil fuel supplies are used to coerce other states. They're something that are used both as part of war, but also as part of political coercion. But in addition to that, the kind of context that we've been hearing about today of rearmament and of militarization is also placing its kind of own constraints as well as driving the climate crisis. It's placing constraints on how we are able to mitigate or deal with the climate crisis. So this context of surging militarism that we've been discussing is its kind of its own bind on the ability of states to deal with and to address the climate crisis that we're living through. And I think that it's kind of important to kind of step back a little bit at that moment and to think a bit about where we're going with this increased military spending in Europe and kind of what that is meaning for our ability to address the climate crisis. We've had a lot of discussion today of the new military spending targets that have been accepted by almost all NATO members. And I think just as a kind of addition to that discussion, I think it's very important to contextualize this figure of 5% of GDP that has not been designed, as it's commonly understood, as a kind of a measure of how much military spending is needed for states to defend themselves, actually is just a transplant of the US strategy, which is roughly 3.5% of GDP that's spent on the military, to this kind of 3.5% hard military spending target for European countries, with an additional 1.5% in national security spending. So what we're seeing is that there is a kind of agenda that's being forced on European countries as something that's kind of framed as a defensive measure, but in reality is much more about a kind of transfer of state resources to militaries and military industries. And we're seeing these massive increases in military spending in a moment when Western countries already dominate global military spending. So about 55% of global military spending is by NATO members. A third of it is by the US, and a fifth is already in Central and Western Europe. So if we go up to 5% of GDP, that would see NATO's military spending nearly triple over the next decade, hitting an estimated $4.2 trillion from $1.5 trillion today. And in the UK context, just the core 3.5% of that target would mean an additional £75 billion per year in military spending. So all of this requires massive government resources, resources that are being promised to militaries and military industries, and resources that are not being used to address the climate crisis or to go towards social needs. And if we look at research that's been done by the New Economics Foundation and the European trade unions, what they found is that additional spending that's been pledged to hit the 5% target is roughly equivalent to the investment gap for climate mitigation in the EU context and the investment gaps for care, housing, and education needs, basically to rebuild public services in line with social needs across Europe. So the process of militarization that is placing huge demands on public investment and on state resources over the next decade is going to see this kind of transfer of resources to military sectors when those same resources would be sufficient to address the climate crisis in our context. And as Sam discussed a little bit before, I think it's also important to understand that that is a kind of a direct process of some of those resources being taken from civilian areas, taken from green industries and climate priorities, and being transferred to the military sector. So, in the UK context, the government had announced actually before it came into power a national wealth fund that was partly used to cultivate green industries. It was meant to be there for things like developing new battery manufacturing facilities. But since the government's come into power, it's opened up that national wealth fund as well to investments in military industries. And just as that as the aid budget has been cut in order to transfer resources into increasing military spending, we've seen that within that aid budget, international climate finance contributions, which are essential for the global process of decarbonisation, have also been cut. And then if we look at the kind of the state of manufacturing industries across Europe, what we're seeing is that while manufacturing is in a moment of crisis, it's in a moment of decline, kind of major sector being the German automotive sector, these sectors are not being transitioned into green industries. They're not being used to meet social needs as they kind of face crisis. They are transitioning into military production. So I think the kind of the most stark example of that is Volkswagen's factory in Osnabrück in Germany, which employs about 2,300 workers. It's currently in discussion with Rafael, which is an Israeli state-owned arms company, to convert the facility to make Iron Dome style missile systems. And I think what's kind of most stark about that case is it really shows that this agenda of militarization is not about defense, because there actually isn't any sort of defensive justification to have a kind of Iron Dome style system within Europe. It can only be used against targets that are, or sorry, within Germany, because it could only be used against targets that are within 70 kilometers of the border. So to be using an Iron Dome, you would need to have a kind of a small group near the German border that was trying to fire missiles at Germany. And what we're seeing is that our kind of industrial capacity is being used instead of meeting kind of urgent crises such as the climate crisis. Is being used for these agendas which ultimately don't necessarily have any social purpose. But there are other direct ways in which the climate agenda and militarization have been set against each other. And another kind of important one to focus on is that of raw materials. What you see in terms of the military industry and green industries is that they rely on similar material inputs. So minerals that are essential for green industries, whether that's green transport industries or green energy, are also used in the military industry. And in the EU, in the UK, the US, these raw materials are being increasingly targeted by the national security state. So in the US, which is the most stark example of this, you have the Pentagon planning a cobalt and graphite stockpile that would be enough to produce 100,000 electric buses per year if it was devoted to the green transition instead. And in the EU and the UK context, what you have is this kind of increasing securitization of mineral supplies. They're being treated as a kind of national security priority and prioritized for military industries rather than being prioritized for green industries, which obviously are essential to addressing the climate crisis. Finally, I think it's important to touch on the fact that both the green industries and military industries compete for the same groups of skilled workers. So I've done a lot of research, as Anna mentioned, interviewing people who work in the military industry, and kind of one of the interesting dynamics that's come out of that is that you find that people who work in parts of the military industry, especially naval shipbuilding, have often previously worked in green industries such as offshore wind manufacturing. And that's because they're basically relying on a similar set of skills, especially steel work, something that's in short supply in most Western countries at the moment. And what you have is both the capacity to do that steel work. You have naval shipyards that used to work in offshore wind manufacturing that now aren't doing so because they're obviously getting many more lucrative contracts within the military industry, that path is being closed off, but also the workers that are needed for green manufacturing industries, predominantly going to the military industry because that is the area of expansion at the moment. So while we have kind of in that fundamental sense, military industries are fundamental sources of emissions. Military power is a kind of is used to control energy supplies and used as coercion. And then we have this process of militarization, which is kind of foreclosing the green transition in Europe. Where do universities sit within this? So as Ginsella has covered and Sam and Anna have touched on as well, universities are kind of deeply embedded within networks of military research and development. Obviously, other parts of the education system are impacted as well as we've heard about schools. And I think it's important to understand that while the private weapons companies are making money from military spending and militarization, we have universities playing a kind of public and government funded role in supporting their work. So companies like BAE Systems are getting their kind of research and development done on their behalf, both by universities and kind of directly subsidized by governments. In 2022, BAE Systems paid for just 14% of its own research and development costs. And we have a university system in which the coordinating capacity of the government is much more directed to ensuring that both skills and research is going towards the military sector rather than developing green manufacturing sectors. Those leaving universities are kind of entering an economy in which funding is flowing to military sectors rather than green industries, and that's something that has also come through a lot in interviews that I've done with workers in military industries. They might have done an engineering degree hoping to work in renewable energy sectors and ended up being forced to work in the military sector because that's ultimately where they could find a job. Um,
Thank you, Kim. I'm
but
going to have
oh,
to
sorry.
ask you just 30 more seconds to wrap up.
Oh, that's perfect because I was coming to the end anyway. And I was just going to say, and that kind of ending point, that although we're in this situation where universities and that kind of government capacity that's so important within the economy is being devoted towards military sectors and the arms industry, because those universities are being used in that way, we can also see the potential they would have if devoted towards social needs, if that research and development capacity was given towards the developing socially useful sectors such as green industries, green energy, and public transport.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Kim. And I'm sorry to have